blocks. That is a kind of very natural notion of the volume, and you have still some notion of a distance, a geodesic distance in this case, then you can just make this measurement, and just allowed us to extract a Hausdorff dimension of now a particular class of models. And somewhat surprisingly, the finding was that this dimension, in some n going to infinity limit, didn't recover at all the expected number, which would be 4, because 4-dimensional building blocks was the thing you started with. So there are various lessons to be learned from this. So let me just write them down explicitly, because, as I claim, they are rather generic. So they're not very particular, to this one approach. So firstly, if you work in this kind of non-perturbative approach, dimension, various notions of dimension one might have, becomes a dynamical notion. And I mean here in the sense that it just does not have to coincide with what you feed in at the outset, in terms of the dimensionality of your building blocks. And as I said, well, the reason for this is, of course, you're taking non-trivial limits, infinite limits, obviously. And ultimately, well, what is responsible is the fact that if you are in a certain region of phase space, by phase space, I just mean, the bare couplings that you're putting into the weights of your path integrals, they have a certain weight, then the system is driven to a particular class of configurations. And this class of configurations, in the cases we looked at yesterday, has absolutely nothing to do with extended geometries. But in the one case, we found these kind of crumpled configurations which have just a tiny diameter and lots of volume stuffed in. And on the other hand, we found another extreme where the system is driven to preferentially form these kind of branched polymeric structures. And of course, when you look, at these polymers, if you go closer, of course, if you go then back to the cutoff scale, of course, you'll see that there are your four-dimensional building blocks are still there. But that's not the point. I mean, you're interested in the structure on scales that is, at least kind of a magnitude larger than the scale of the individual building blocks, because that just tells you something about the bias you're putting in by your rather arbitrary regularization construction.
Technically plausible, that are very difficult to do. And so governments can invest in those things because they can keep their eye on that goal for the long term. So for fusion, that's 60 years of investment, not just at my lab, but at many institutions, building big machines, learning, understanding, developing computational models, technology advancing. Without that patient, application of patient capital over time, it's not clear how we get to this point. So someone has to lay those foundations. I agree. I think the other thing is it takes a little bit of swagger to do big things, right? So it's another thing that governments can bring is that ambition and say, we know this is difficult, we know the scale is very large, but the outcome, the potential is so transformational that it's worth taking these risks and moving a long time.
Well, good afternoon,
and I think the other thing is when we have hard problems and you put resources on the table, great people come to those problems. People really want to do meaningful things. They want to do things at scale. They want to make a contribution that's going to stand the test of time. And so governments can invest in a way on some of these problems that draw the right people to the field to enable you to see that path, that plausible path to get from idea A to outcome B, even though some of the pieces that you need along the way may not exist right now.
Yeah. Nubar, what would you say about sort of government investment and the kinds of things that maybe you are looking into?
No, I couldn't agree more. I just want to say though, really in thinking about this, because we use the word patient capital a lot, and I want to emphasize that it's not the patience that's important, it's the allowance for something that doesn't look logically proximal today. And the problem is that in science, we essentially use organized skepticism to essentially shoot down everybody's ideas. And I would say the easiest thing, we practice it all the time, is to actually shoot down other people's ideas. And we're good at it. The problem is that if your idea is beyond the bounds of where you could prove how you're going to get there from here, it's even easier. And people kind of then get discouraged. And of course, funders want some consensus that this is a good idea to fund. Anything that can achieve consensus that it's a good idea to fund, again, isn't worth funding. And governments can actually say, you know what, I'm going to do some of each. And I was at a, of course, you can't be here.
So you see, the difficulty then appears to be, or at least one of the difficulties, is to generate something that's four-dimensional and has a nice kind of classical limit. So it's non-trivial to dynamically generate an extended four-dimensional quantum geometry.
So my longest standing, I've done this for a long time, as I said, my longest standing.
And of course, it has to do also with the non-perturbative nature, that you really allow that your spacetimes, or the kind of the virtual spacetimes, the sum over and the path integral, on very short scales, can be highly quantum fluctuating, can be very, very far away from classicality. And then you can run into these degeneracy.
So the point for scientists and engineers, how do you harness that? Yeah. Because that is nothing more like selection pressure. All you have to do is coming up with idea after idea after idea, let people tell you all the ways, and then pin them down. Say, okay, but if I could show you this, this, and this, if I could show you 1/100th of the input energy going to a target, but then coming out 3, 4, 5-fold increase, does that do the trick? And I think people would have told you, yeah, if you could do that, that's begins to make it, what my physicist brother usually says, but that's just engineering. So anything he doesn't so
but there's nothing.
But that's a fun attitude, because to me, that's what breakthrough moonshot science is let's make things engineering. And that's the crossing of the chasm that I think government is uniquely obligated to do, because private markets can't rationalize it, however patient they want to be.
Yeah. So, Bob, Commonwealth Fusion has raised over $2 billion at this point, and they've signed a major deal with Google. And that's capital that could have funded thousands of megawatts of solar or wind power today. So,
of course, if by hand you suppress these fluctuations, then of course you can just force yourself back to some situation where you're sitting very close to, say, Minkowski space. But that's not the point.
World Bank, a preserved Amazon rainforest is worth $317 billion per year.
Here's a summary of the article.
Sao Paulo, Brazil. A report produced this month by the World Bank suggests a development model for the Brazilian Amazon region that combines ecosystem preservation with economic growth through a process of urban revitalization in cities considered strategic. According to the international lender, preserving the rainforest
it's a drop in the bucket. It is not going to change the future. But $3 billion at National Initiative Facility could lead to an entire new industry. It could reshape the way we think of energy at all. Like, it could lead to an energy system that is 10 times more energy intensive than we have today. And so that's the return on investment. And it goes to the uncertainty. I can't guarantee that's going to happen.
Forest is worth up to 7 times what can be obtained through exploitative activities such as logging, agriculture, and mining. According to World Bank calculations, the Amazon rainforest is worth at least USD $317 billion.
Where you're sitting very close to, say, Minkowski space. But that's not the point. Of course, what you want to show is there is a non-trivial quantum dynamics, and the fluctuations are allowed to be large on the Planck scale, the natural scale we associated with these. But nevertheless, they conspire in a quantum superposition to something that is meaningful on very large scales and has a nice classical limit. So,
how would you advise either government or philanthropic funders to distribute their support or fund?
I can comment on government. I think government should put their money where private support won't. Okay. And so, to the point that Nubar made governments should be taking the risk and looking for the areas where there is some pathway. It's very difficult.
Well, in the best of all worlds, that's what we want to find. So, I subsumed this type of non-perturbative surprise by saying, well, it's really due, you can think of it as being due to entropy.
They should really try to find those
By
areas.
entropy, I mean
A situation where
number of microstates that realize, a given value of the weight or the action weight, e to the IS or e to the minus s of some Euclidean weight. And if you're in a perturbative situation, see, you could think of it, if you wanted to translate it to a continuum language, as the measure. But
material and money to do it. And the uncertainty was like a factor of 2. It was not a factor of 10, right? And there's a lot of problems that are like that. But the scale of them is such that if you don't get to the starting point, if all you do is say, I'm going to take 100 bets of $10 million each, you will never have them. If you say, like, I'm going to do one bet out of $1 billion, your odds of getting success go way up. Think about someone like Jeff Bezos and rockets, right? If he took $1 billion and put it into 10 rocket companies or 100 rocket companies, he never gets to orbit. How much did Blue take to get to orbit? We don't know, but like it's probably enough to fund several attempts, but because it's concentrated, it punched through. And there's a lot of these technologies, mRNA is one of them. If you don't have the ability to punch it all the way through, 10 years, $10 billion, you shouldn't even get started. So in portfolio construction, it's not really about like, how much you spread it around. It's how much you concentrate it. And governments working together with private capital, with different types of private capital, can actually build a stack that can punch it through. Or a tech company can build a stack.
so why don't you see that semi-classically as a measure? Because, well, the measure doesn't have any tunable constants associated with it. Whereas, if you have e to the is or e to the minus s Euclidean, there are tunable parameters in there. And if you think of, putting your h bar in there, you have, of course, s divided by h bar. And for sufficiently small h bar, the contributions from the action will always dominate. So in what you call a classical limit over anything that comes from the measure. So that's why these are contributions you don't see in this way, semi-classically. So for this, then you do.
All the way through, but then don't just do one thing. And the other thing I want to just add to this discussion is government can come in 2 ways. One is input, the other is ensuring the output. The problem with these things, with these kinds of approaches, is that the market isn't clear, even if you succeed. So for example, how much should society pay for fusion? The presumption has been grid parity, cost of electricity. I think that's garbage, as far as I'm concerned. I think there should be a government-induced demand signal at a higher price, we can debate what that is, sufficient to prime the pump, so that people aren't just getting handouts to do this work, they're actually getting a reward. And the example I'll give you is what Operation Warp Speed did during COVID. Most people think Operation Warp Speed gave money to invent the mRNA technology. It did not.
No.
Then people thought it helped us perfect the technology. It did not. What it did is partially fund the scale up. That was important. But what it mostly did is to create no uncertainty as to what several 100 million doses would be bought at by the government. Once that market signal is set,
need to be able to evaluate these Sandler integrals non-perturbatively. Okay, well, here's a suggested cure. As I said, this is very generic.
doing the testing, but I don't want to end up at the end of the day and people go, no, sorry, we won't ask them.
What you find for these dynamically triangulated models. But to cut a long story short, because I have only about 45 minutes left in the course, you make
carbon capture, set a price, create a market, and say, you know what? I'll buy the first 1 billion tons at $50, $75, and then back off. That, maybe it's not 1 billion, maybe it's 500 million. I don't care what the volume is. That creates a market certainty that then people can start making their bets on. So I don't think the government needs to actually pay for all this. They need to send
Overshoot, hello?
certainty, and then they need to not change their mind. And then
It's interesting where we're at in a macro breakout cycle, and how I would like a full Davos meeting to be centered around the concept of, is overshoot a principle of the profits only? Do wizards not recognize overshoot? Why or why not?
I think setting that roadmap is really important. That, you know, what you have to believe for this to be an important technology in the world, and saying, okay, I'm going to structure step by step the right sequence so that you know you're on the right path, and make those quantitative pieces of the roadmap. And we have that actually in Fusion pretty well. We know what those pieces are, and that's facilitated the investment that's gone into the Fusion ecosystem today. We know what a good experiment is. Lots of experiments at NIF that didn't work right, but they had the right signals on that roadmap that said you should keep going.
You put an additional structure on this dynamical triangulation. So the results where, you know, this funny Hausdorff dimension came out, they referred to these isotropic configurations, these Euclidean configurations, where I hadn't distinguished any time, direction, I hadn't distinguished, there was no causal structure anywhere in the geometries. So the claim is, if you reintroduce this in a specific way, you're curing this problem here.
You made this point earlier about the skeptics.
This will still be true to an extent, and you will still find that on.
It's important to be, you know, maintain your technical humility when you're doing things like this. They're hard. And having people come in and challenge you along the way and force you to answer those difficult questions. So when we turned the National Ignition Facility on, we had a very clear plan. We had a definite success-oriented strategy that was going to yield results immediately, and it did not. It took us 12 years. And we had to change the technical path we were on, with many people helping us shape that next version of the roadmap by asking hard questions. What is it about this first try that didn't work? What are the things that you can control that might make it better? What are different strategies you might take that would make the target geometries, for example, more robust? And so that is an important lesson, I think, on these roadmaps, to always be questioning and always be, you know, technically rigorous in the way you're measuring yourself against those milestones.
Yeah, you also asked about failure. I think that's an interesting issue. You know, humans use words very carefully, and it usually has deep consequences. From an evolutionary standpoint, if you think that a lot of competing species in a particular moment ultimately lead to one prevailing and advancing.
Very small scales, dimensions are not what we expect them to be, but on large scales, they approach asymptotically 4. So that's. So
experiments that were done. There's just this continuum. I don't view, like, a failure is when you have an ill-conceived experiment where you don't get the right signal out of it, whether the result was one or the opposite of that. And you're supposed to, in science, try to falsify hypotheses. You're supposed to kind of like literally set up situations for failure, and then failing to fail should give you the right to go to the next step. We've lost the sense of that. There's some derogatory aspect of failure. So actually, you know, it's an interesting question. It's funny, even the Constitution, the notion of patents exists. And what are patents? Patents are a deal between inventors and society, but they will actually make known their invention so that other people can benefit from the positive signal and improve upon it. In exchange, they get some exclusivity. Imagine a world, I've never really thought of this before, but imagine a world...
It's interesting to say. So these are causal dynamical triangulations, and CDT abbreviated, so something I've worked on for quite some years. If you want to look at a recent set of lecture notes, you can go to the archives, 1007 2560. Because I will be only able to sketch this very briefly.
This was my idea. Patents do it on the positive. I think the negative with AI, with connectivity, we should think about it. But I really think that all prior attempts should be the happy ancestors of the ultimate successes, not failures.
Yeah.
We describe it internally as, are we doing research or are we paying tuition? I don't want to pay tuition. I don't want to learn things that are already learned. I just want to know them. But what I do want to do is research, where I want to be pushing the edge. I want to be going to something that, like, we don't know the right answer, but after we do the work, we will know.
Okay.
And that's a key thing about a good design for how to very efficiently get through uncertainty.
That's a great.
If you always get the answer you expect, you're not asking very interesting questions. You do have to be
Today. So the issue, I have these totally Euclidean structures. How do I reintroduce some causality back there? Well, one step is kind of very simple. I've already mentioned this. You don't use Euclidean building blocks, but you use Minkowskian building blocks.
The advantage that these tools may afford us, we're going to have to begin to think about data.
So you cut them out not from flat Euclidean space, but you think of them as being cut out from a Minkowskian flat space. And the distinction is, of course, well, the geometric properties of it are different. And I do have light cones in there. Secondly, this is what it turns out. Well, one has to do. One doesn't have too much choice, actually, in doing this. One introduces a notion of time, and more specifically, its proper time, and forbids certain acausal configurations to appear. And these are known affectionately as baby universes.
For joining me, and looking forward to what's going to come from some of your great
So let me just make a drawing. Let's keep things very simple. Let's see what it entails in 2 dimensions. So just to illustrate, so let me, time goes this way, up in my drawings. Now, what's a typical contribution to the path integral in this causal formulation? So a CDT history, I could call it.
Transaction and the time it takes. So
these geometries are like what you require in the classical theory. They are a Cartesian product of a time axis and some spatial manifold of some topology. We are in 2 dimensions. Let's be very simple-minded and choose the spatial topology just to be a compact S1. So my spatial universe is just a circle. And the only geometric characteristic it has is a length. So all it can do is kind of fluctuate as a function of time. That length can fluctuate. So it's like a quantum mechanical model in some way. So this is always what one of these CDT histories looks like. It's a 2-dimensional triangulation, but you've cut it up into kind of discrete spatial slices. So this is, some proper time, and then you have adjacent slices which are of different lengths in general, and they're triangulated in some way.
Cost savings, real-time traceability and visibility of the payments. You can see it going from A to B to C. And perhaps most importantly, the beneficiaries could receive aid.
So it's like, strips of triangles, up and down triangles, between each step, t and t plus delta t, where these come in units of 1.
To systematize this. And so we thought when we created the Circle Foundation last year, we thought, well, what better way to leverage that grant making capacity than to support a project that is more than a project.
So here's a piece of triangulation for you, and the idea is then you have here some out geometry, some other boundary of a certain length. So this is what the discretized geometries look like in this causal approach. Now, how can I compare them to
agencies, and to do that with digital finance, and do it with
how can I understand what is the essential difference of this to Euclidean geometry?
It's incredibly thrilling to be able to have that that opportunity because modern humanitarian finance needs modern infrastructure, and we're here to help make that happen. So with this grant, what we expect to see is more of what we saw with the Ukrainian example. We expect to see significant cost.
I can also say, okay, I just look at Euclidean geometries that live on, an S1 cross R or S1 cross an interval. But they don't come with any natural notion of time. But what I can always do is I can just by force superimpose a notion of time on them. For example, so that's just what, so this picture will be, so I have just here some, wild Euclidean geometry. It's a cylinder. It has cylinder topology. So what I do is I say I start from this boundary. And then I just look at all points that are a distance one away. So a GD6 step 1. This is just Euclidean with.
It's just, for a company that has a mission to raise global economic prosperity and has created
respect to kind of the Euclidean metric that comes with the triangles. And then I get some slicing, you see. And I then look, what is one more step away, a distance 2 away from my initial surface. I can clearly kind of slice this just by brute force, say starting from a non-trivial boundary. So what's now the difference between those guys and those guys? So these are also triangulated in some way. The difference here is that.
I'll leave it to the UN to talk about, but essentially anywhere money flows, for whatever reason, whether it's getting money from A to B across borders, whether it's over time, credit and lending, anywhere where money flows, anywhere where there's a movement of value, you're currently using currencies that are traditional currencies, use digital currencies, which are literally tied exactly 1-for-1 to the fiat currency, and it can enable an explosion of opportunity. The way to think about it is it's kind of like, back in the at the relative dawn of the internet, when we were maybe, let's call it, I don't know, the late 90s, and the most that, I'll just speak from my own experience, I thought about the internet as this kind of cool thing, and oh wow, I could email people, I have an AOL account, and that's kind of cool. And what we all kind of understood at that time was that communication was able to go from A to B, and B to C, and maybe D to Z, or whatever, and that was happening in real time. There was very little cost. It seemed that securely my messages would arrive somewhere else. It didn't matter what hour of the day, didn't matter what continent the person was on. Communication was just free flowing. That was kind of essentially the essential sort of commodity at that base layer. And then if I told myself in 1997, where's this going to go? What's this internet going to become? And someone really smart came to me and said, well, imagine what you can do if you start layering on top of that GPS and payments and two-sided marketplaces.
When I do this for a generic Euclidean geometry, it's not true that this will be of the form of an interval cross S1. Because typically, as I run through this, you see, I will find at a given time step, well, things can split up and they can end here. You see, if I cut it somewhere here,
this will uplift that and significantly.
At some time step, I find not a single S1, but 3. So there's one here, and there's one here. So at this
we are really delighted with this partnership, I have to say. They say that out of crisis comes opportunity, and it also comes with a certain drive towards innovation, finding new solutions, and that sense of the need to do that, the need to both find solutions in the midst of a humanitarian funding crisis that really kicked off in earnest, if you will, last year, but we were already feeling some of the side effects of that in previous years. Elizabeth, you mentioned it was sort of 21, 22 that we launched this pilot, if you will. But really, this grant from Circle is enormously important because it is in a way a perfect marriage of different things and the expression of something that the humanitarian.
They're all over. If you take a general Euclidean triangulation and you force such a time slicing upon it, then you will just find that this happens generically. So at any given time, whether the topology will change as a function of time, generally speaking. So this is a general dynamically triangulated history. So a Euclidean object, an inherently Euclidean object. And the point is here that the spatial topology will change as a function of time.
Those people know more about what they need than we do as the UN or another humanitarian organization.
As a function of time.
In that particular moment to survive, and they don't need
Now, of course, these are not real geometries. I mean, they are virtual past integral histories. So there is absolutely nothing wrong with these histories in the first place, because we don't know what, generalized kind of configurations we should be summing over in the path integral to contribute to the quantum amplitude. No one tells us. Now, the point is to say, can I just do either of these things, do the computations, see what I get, and compare whether I get equivalent or identical outcomes? And the answer is, well, you can do the calculations, and as I already mentioned yesterday, the outcomes are different and really inequivalent in terms of their physical properties, their scaling properties. So these are two inequivalent models. And this is, well, as far as I know, kind of the first very just explicit toy model of quantum geometry where this was explicitly shown. So in d equal to 2, CDT and dt path integrals lead to inequivalent